Morning, dear colleagues. I'm happy to welcome you in this auditorium. I'm happy that you found the time to attend this interesting discussion. I hope you will find it both interesting and useful for those of you here, business representatives. The title of this panel discussion is How to Win in Global Market Competition. I could call it the Swiss panel. I'll tell you why later. Now, I would like to ask my technical staff to bring up one question on the screen. What really matters to Ukrainian businesses? It is public policy to protect the domestic producer, or through various protection mechanisms, or businesses should seek to increase their own competitiveness, or number three is government support, various preferences. I would like to kindly ask you to scan in this QR code, and then as you vote, we will monitor this dynamic and how your opinions change about what matters to businesses. Now, Ukraine has been a member of the WTO for over 10 years now, which has enabled Ukraine to integrate into the global economy, which is represented by countries that are members of the World Trade Organization, which is almost 100% of world trade. Almost all countries are members of the WTO alongside Ukraine. What we've seen over the past 5 years is explosive growth in Ukrainian exports, geographically and otherwise. What I find most remarkable is that new players that come on board are not necessarily large companies, but also small, medium-sized enterprises, not only our agriculture companies, but also our fashion designers. 4 Ukrainian designers staged their shows in New York only last week, and it is a great achievement. Now, we are going to speak about achieving competitiveness in global markets and what businesses should do to prepare themselves, and we're going to discuss this with Ukrainian businessmen, visionaries, and foreign guests. I'm most honored to introduce our panel of experts. Robert Koopman, Chief Economist and Director of the Department of Economic Research and Statistics of the World Trade Organization. I don't really know as much about the WTO, but what I know is when you exit the highway towards Geneva, there is this big building, the offices of the WTO. So I'm actually envious. I'm jealous of you, Mr. Koopman.
And the Mont Blanc from your window. Is it true?
Yes, I have a very nice view of the lake.
Wonderful. So you can work and meditate at the same time there. Welcome.
I rarely get to look out the window, by the way, but it's nice that it's there.
Welcome to our panel. Then наступний speaker, Margaret.
The next speaker is Margaret Jenny, managing partner of Horizon Group, an expert in international competitiveness, world trade, and a speaker of the World Economic Forum at Davos. Also originally from Switzerland. I've never been invited to speak at an international forum in Davos, but I run the most beautiful marathon each year, the Jungfrau Marathon, which is in Switzerland. So I can only imagine what horizons are opening up from both Davos and Jungfrau. Margaret?
On the board here.
Thank you.
Welcome. Taras Kachka, заступник
Taras Kachka, Vice Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Agriculture, Ukraine's trade representatives. Unlike myself, everyone seems to know Taras at the WTO. He was one of the people who was prominently involved in securing Ukraine's membership, and Taras, as part of this organization, has been really one of the champions of Ukrainian interests at the WTO. Welcome, Taras. Dmitro Linek, chair of the Council of Federations of Employers. What connects him with Switzerland is that he loves skiing and often goes to ski in Switzerland. I'm sure you have so many partners who are members of your federation with either offices in Switzerland or doing business with Switzerland. Happy to welcome you. And Gennady Chizhikov, president of the Chamber of Commerce of Ukraine, is the person who is always the first on my Facebook news feed. It's what was the marathon that you ran today? Tomorrow, yeah? Is it tomorrow you're going to do it, right? My 76th marathon, and you will ask me what connects Gennady with Switzerland. Next year, he's going to run the most beautiful marathon, Jungfrau, next year. So now you are in the limelight. So think hard before you answer. Okay, I'm happy to welcome you on this panel, dear colleagues. Please remember to cast your votes. We are about to begin our discussion. And this is, the first question goes to Mr. Koopman. Mr. Koopman, can you please tell us, the World Trade Organization, to the best of my knowledge, it is an organization, it's not one that dictates rules. This is a forum where each country could pursue a dialogue and look for opportunities to defend its economic interests. Is that the correct way of putting it?
That's correct. The WTO is a forum where members come together. They are able to express their national interests and try to negotiate on a common set of rules or understandings. Those rules help provide a stable, more certain environment for global trade so that firms have a much more stable platform in understanding what the rules will be when they trade. But that does not mean that members are absolutely locked into those rules. The idea is there's an agreement around them, a cooperative understanding. If members have a disagreement about whether or not one country's imposing those rules or not, there's a process to litigate that. And even if you lose that litigation, it doesn't mean you have to change your domestic policy, but it may mean that the country that's complaining about your policy gets to impose some sort of retaliatory measure to compensate for the lost sales or the lost commercial advantage. So it's a complex arrangement, but it does not remove sovereignty. I think that's a common mistake, that if you agree to something at the WTO, you've lost your sovereignty. You keep your sovereignty, but the idea is that there's this, as I said, a cooperative understanding that agreeing to these rules is in the best interest of everybody. And that reduces uncertainty, and uncertainty is really a bad thing for global business. So the more certain you are about what the rules will be, what the current conditions will be in your global exchange, it makes it much easier for firms to be able to engage competitively in the global economy.
Дякую дуже. Скажіть, будь ласка, які ви дати
What advice could you give to Ukraine as a nation? How to go about building dialogues within the framework of the WTO to be successful in defending its national interests? What would be your best advice to Ukraine?
the best advice is to make sure you come here and use the forum to exchange to present your interest and your views. But I also think one thing that many people don't realize is that it's often about negotiation and compromise. So it's often very firm. Countries will come here and they'll want to get something, but if they want to get something, that usually means somebody else wants something. So how do you negotiate and reach agreement where you can exchange concessions to get a positive outcome for everybody? And I think that's something that many countries often lose sight of. It's like, we want it this way and we don't want to give on anything. But that's not what negotiation is typically about. Negotiation is about give and take and trying to find a way to reach something that you can all live with that helps improve the business environment while also defending your interests. But that's that can be a very complex trade-off. I will say this, that to be competitive in the global economy, it's very hard to do that without engaging in trade and engaging in global value chains, global supply chains. Often imports help your companies be more competitive in the domestic market as well as in the export market. So, I think there is this mistaken belief that if you could do it on your own, you should. Often that means you won't be very competitive in the global market. So looking for those compromises that help you integrate globally generally has very positive impacts on your long-term growth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Koopman. I fully agree with you. Тарасе, я б хотіла поставити тобі питання.
Taras, the next question goes to you. Do you find that Ukraine has largely exhausted all possible tools to put Ukraine's best foot forward in terms of representing its national interests at the WTO, but at the same time to represent Ukrainian businesses and their interests? Thank you for the question. So, one qualification, what it is we mean whenever we say or use the term representing Ukrainian interests abroad. The WTO is only one avenue. We are represented across a large multitude of various modalities, and in particular, as the Chamber of Commerce is creating business-to-business bilateral contacts, helping facilitate that kind of commercial diplomacy or sending trade missions to other countries. It is the ECA that is helpful, and this Dmitro is going to comment on the painstaking process of creating Ukraine's own ECA. I'm an optimist ex officio, actually, but when we speak about the World Trade Organization, Ukraine is only beginning to think about how to defend itself. Unfortunately, the traditions of Ukrainian diplomacy, not only trade diplomacy, is to hold the stance as neutral as possible. And now that Ukraine is suddenly beginning to express its position, it comes as a surprise to the WTO. When we were exceeding the WTO, we were taught how to do it. So the terms that Ukraine obtained was a good mirror. It's like, it's how the Spanish conquistadors, in fact, were paying to exchange gold for trinkets. And our terms were actually worse because there was quite some deceit on the parts of the EU and the United States, because they blocked certain streams of negotiations as part of the Doha agenda. And we have been really quite vocally bring this to the table. Without a reform of the World Trade Organization, unless this trauma is remedied, we will not be able to actually preserve this important organization. And what we've seen is that the World Trade Organization, as an organization, so we should bear in mind that it is there to provide a forum for member countries to hold negotiations. So it's actually the Secretariat which gathers a lot of top-notch intellectuals, and I appreciate the caliber of people working at the Secretariat, but the backbone of these organizations is our trade missions. And most countries keep their permanent missions. Ukraine is a rare example. We don't have a separate, dedicated WTO mission. We have one mission that covers all Geneva-based international institutions, and it has its own mark, leaves its own mark on our diplomatic work. But what is interesting now in global trade, in this particular segment, is that we are now experiencing a situation that actually reminds us of the 1980 situation before the Uruguay round. We remember when the Marrakesh agreements were signed to create the WTO, and everyone has this big handbook, legal text, and of the Marrakesh accords, and it's some 500 pages worth of. And we were taught that that is our Bible. It is sacred, and it is unchangeable, but it came as the product of much compromise and battles. And this is another example of intellectual deception. But what we've got to bear in mind, that is the advantage of developed nations, because they use those intellectual constructs to embed their own interests amid those pages and pages. Look, this is important. Now, what is going on now? There's a lot of discussion on the way to discuss the future of trade. Yes, we are in favor of global rules of the game, but we want to see them balanced. We don't want another corrupted intellectual construct. That global rules are those that are most comfortable for developed nations, and everyone has to put up with that. We need more balance in those rules, but at the same time, we've got to learn to appreciate that even developed nations, those big players, increasingly emphasize that the art of bilateral negotiations are more important sometimes than global rules. It's what we've seen through their recent initiatives and how their administrations have been defending decisions that were not in line with WTO principles, but they're defending them all the same. We've got to learn to do that too. We still labor under this illusion that of those romantic principles of integration. We've got to cast them aside and fall back on good old pragmatism. And this is what we have actually done when we attended the recent summit of food systems, and the president actually raised that all discussions about sustainable development in agriculture should not be used as a cover, as a disguise for over-subsidizing agriculture at the national level. And we will continue defending the same position during the COP26 conference coming up in Glasgow. You said that we were taught to how to exceed the WTO back then. Maybe we should be taught to conduct negotiations more successfully for our voice to be heard. Okay, what happened then is now history, but I'm curious to find out what is going on now, what is being done to use the WTO, this powerful forum, to put our best foot forward in presenting and defending Ukraine's national interests. Now it's actually a lot of boring work now. Why boring? Yeah, let me expand on this. Why boring work? Now there's this big event being prepared. This is a biannual meeting of trade ministers, and that is the top governing body within the WTO. And the agenda and the documents will be discussed, topping the agenda of the WTO as an organization. Now, fishing subsidies. It's not one of the mainstream topics, admittedly, and just to limit this to a professional discussion among fishing experts, okay, this could work, but that is not the top item. One of the top items is whether we can contain the US and China and the EU within this general framework. And we are not there yet in terms of even beginning that discussion in earnest. Whether the question is whether we can conceivably put on the table a declaration that all WTO members will be happy to sign, and then think about how to regain trust in the WTO at the next phase. What is really we seem to have now strayed into a topic where businesses have the least involvement or participation from the EU or US or China. This is pure diplomacy in terms of who allies with whom, and but that's skeleton on which tariff policy is based and protectionism is based. No, in practice, what's going on there is we know the safeguard measures as one instrument. And back in the 1980s, the safeguard measures would work like a nuclear weapon, but by virtue of the fact that a nation moves to impose those safeguard measures would have been considered as a big failure of the trading system as such. Now, the European Union, under its own legislation, has imposed safeguard measures on metals, having no basis to impose those. But then again, it's part of that WTO orthodoxy. But it was actually a sensible decision to defend their own national interests. We've decided to do the same. Then the EU goes, no, you may not do it. Let's do it reciprocally. You set aside those barriers and we will do the same. And it is out of that new global rules are born. It's when individual action is taken by individual countries, be it the EU or Ukraine or Moldova or Turkey. Now, we've got to bear in mind that our trade policy is not written in Geneva, in Brussels. It must be written in Kiev and must be firmly rooted in Ukraine's national interests. And the future of the WTO will very much depend on our negotiation directives. That I couldn't agree more. Thank you. Now I would like to move on to the most crucial item on this agenda. Well, businesses may not be represented at such organizations, the WTO, but businesses have a way of shaping the views of the ministries of trade and other ministries. Now, let's now discuss the important topic of expanding Ukrainian exports. Now, what is the Ministry of Economy now, and is there any kind of golden standard? What would be a roadmap necessary to be put in place to see an expansion of Ukrainian exports? We've been seeing consistently an expansion of Ukrainian exports year after year. And it's been going on for quite some years. Even back in 2020, when there was this overall decline, our nominal exports only contracted by 1%. And 65% of our exports are just a handful of items: metals, metal ores, grain, vegetable oil, and oil cake. And many are arguing this is a problem within Ukraine, that we Okay, why sell commodities? Why not convert them into higher value added products and derive more value? But okay, Australia has a very similar export profile. When you have millions in commodities, it doesn't mean you're not producing anything else. And in commodities is an area where you do not see disruptive change. It's actually it's patient diplomacy. It is negotiations with Southeast Asia, for instance. Now we learned to sell our grain direct to Indonesia, not to sell through Turkish traders who then add their own markup and sell the same grain onto Indonesia. But at the same time, we've been having to deal with phytosanitary barriers that need to be addressed, and we need to do quite some catching up, and the time which was lost. And you know what? Even entering into free trade areas is also painstaking, boring work. Now we have been at it for over 18 months with Indonesia. Now we've now agreed that we need to commission research on both sides. And then in Egypt, it's like we strike a deal, and then it's kind of that activity subsides, and then we need to rekindle the fire again. So we look forward to a meeting of the bilateral commission to restart these negotiations again. In terms of what is going on in such markets as machine building, industrial markets. Now, we've got two huge challenges here. One is financing, and then Ukraine badly needs an ECA. Now, we are actually trading custom, well, duty free in industrial products, but it means that we have attractive commercial terms because many countries are even prepared to extend interest free financing to acquire our machine building products, let alone impose any customs duties. Okay, sorry for talking so long, but on the other hand, industrial trade diplomacy takes time, and when you need a lot of technical discussions by engineers. Now, they want to see us in South America, in South Africa. And so they not you yourself, but Ukrainian businesses are welcome there. Yeah, but I keep hearing from businesses that there is no policy from the Ministry of Economy. There is no assistance from the government to help Ukrainian businesses tap new markets and expand exports. In particular, most recently about its businesses reporting problems trying to access African markets. Thank you for this very detailed contribution, and I believe that you are truly committed to helping Ukrainian businesses establish a presence in foreign markets. Dmitro, I am convinced that if, okay, a Ukrainian manufacturer, a successful producer in Ukraine with strong sales in Ukraine, then isn't it that company would be internationally competitive by definition if it is like a strong brand? And isn't it true that if you know how to win in your own country, then you will stand a very good chance of winning an international competition? Would you subscribe to this viewpoint? Look, in order to become an exporter, you certainly should do your trials in the domestic market and then try and make inroads into foreign markets. Now, the next question is the country one that has a policy promoting exports and exporters? And Ukraine, unfortunately, doesn't have one. Look, if we have any exporters here, has the local currency appreciation of 7% really helped? Because exporters now, They budgeted for the rate of exchange of 29 hryvnias for $1, and now it's appreciated 26, and it's all hit hard, hitting hard their budgets because they were making calculations to achieve a pretty slim margin, maybe 5%. Now the appreciation has killed it completely. Now they will end up closing with -2. Look, I did not even want to raise the issue of Ukraine's ECA, but Taras raised it. 2 months in on the 20th December, we'll be celebrating the 5th anniversary of the Ukrainian Export Expansion Act, which was, well, large-scale expansion of Ukrainian Exports Act. We're going to celebrate its 5th anniversary. Now, I paid a visit to the website of the Export Credit Agency, and there's 7 contracts there. And this is very vocal response of how helpful the government has been in promoting exports, in particular through the ECA. I respect you very much, Taras, but I beg to differ from some of your statements. You are, in fact, one of the few highly competent individuals who've stayed and continue working at the government. But the growth that we've seen in exports also has risks because our export profile is deteriorating, as is the economic profile of this nation as a whole, because we're going to fall into this commodity pit. Now, it's good that we've grown by 25%, that we are benefiting from booming ore markets and corn markets, but gas prices were low. But what are we going to do now that this trend has reversed? Now, everyone knows about the TTF gas hub. Those consuming gas now, they are looking at this crazy dynamic, and they're frightened. This is going to deplete our competitiveness. Even to harvest grain to have it dried using gas dryers is going to kill our profitability. And because Ukraine is so energy intensive and gas claims a large chunk of prime cost. Now, we at the Federation of Employers are exploring this, how gas price dynamics are going to affect our results going forward. Now, initial findings. Now, we've been looking at industries where gas is 7% of the cost of production or higher, like chemicals. Yes, certainly in some chemical productions, it's gas is also one of the primary inputs, but it's glass making, but also in food industry, sugar production, dairy, and so on and so forth, covering a very broad range of industries. Now, what we've seen from this research, that we, as a country, now, come October, will lose our international competitiveness. And beginning in October, 60% of industries will become loss makers. And judging from TTF traded futures, 100% of companies will become loss makers. Why? Well, the expert perspective on this. There is this big myth that Ukraine trades under EU trading rules. In the EU, the average gas price is 400 to 500 euros, 300 in Turkey. Slovakia, Hungary, it's 350. Moldova, the price is 200. How can you expect an exporter to be competitive when energy is 3 to 5 times more expensive than the next country? Now, when we look at these projections, and they will actually materialize in official statistics in 6 months' time. And this is unavoidable. From the initial findings of our research that we've seen already, manufacturers freezing production. Why this disparity in the price of gas? Why this myth? It's because countries operate and buy gas under long-term contracts, 80% of that. It's actually the art of negotiations with a time lag. And some of that time lag is 6 months, 9 months. So if you cost your gas and only it's only 20% of spot prices affecting this. If 80% of your gas price as an input cost is locked in, then you can pretty much rely on your projections. Now, this water, I'm holding this bottle in my hand. The producer of this water, Dmitry Nikiforov, is the owner of this company, and I met him this morning at the forum. So what are you going to do? They are exporting their products to many countries, in particular to the Arab world. And when gas begins to play an increasing role in the cost of production, we are losing competitiveness as an economy. And what I can say, unless and until the country begins to favor producers and exporters, until and unless the country stops playing the game of those big countries. It's good, Taras, that the government, the Ministry of Economy, they seem to appreciate the challenge that, unfortunately, WTO rules are sometimes not working and actually being superseded by bilateral rules. But big economies often act like bandits, and we need to have a pride and decency, not to be pushed aside. We need to really use our elbows to defend our positions in international markets, and it's the safeguard measures imposed on metals is a good example. We've got to learn to defend our own national interests, and then this could enable us to increase our export potential, not only by expanding commodities, but also by expanding value-added products and new production that will create jobs. Okay, before we move on to discussing how to defend the interests of domestic Ukrainian producers in the national markets, the first question to be asked is how well they are protected in the home market, and what needs to happen, what needs to be done to improve competitiveness here in the home market. So the next question goes to you, Gennady. The Chamber of Commerce has quite a large number of rep offices all over the globe. I've read recently that by the end of the year, the Chamber of Commerce will have opened a rep office in Algeria, and there is also an export support division. And I know that you just returned from Dubai, and you've been very active promoting the chamber. So where is Ukrainian business losing when setting up exhibition stands or we're trying to promote its products internationally? What is lacking? What do you think is missing? And why are Ukrainian businesses losing? Well, thank you. I can give a very simple answer, but it's a complex one at the same time. Ukrainian businessmen are exporting very little. A very small number of companies out of their total number. We have some 2 to 3 million registered businesses. The total number of exporters is under 100,000. This is a very tiny part compared to our neighboring countries, because export is not something that is treated as part of our national identity. It is the tip of the iceberg. Unfortunately, our businesses do not speak foreign languages, by and large. There's only 1% of the population who can say they speak English fluently, and 50% they think they understand English. Now, our second largest trading partner is China, 50%. We have fewer than 10,000 people who know a word of Chinese. Now, why exports matter? Why I think that this is one of the biggest topics to discuss. Back in 1991, Ukraine had a GDP of $77 billion. Israel, okay, bear in mind that there is a difference in size. Israel was at 65 to 69. Singapore was at 45 billion. Now, as time's gone on, but what we've seen, Ukraine's GDP has grown by a little under 30% over this entire period, while Israel's has increased fivefold and Singapore's sixfold. Do they have oil? Do they have oil and mining? No, only exports. The national idea, the national identity, we sell everything. Look at South Korea. Back in the 50s and 60s, it had almost zero GDP. But now, they've inscribed it as part of the national idea. We will learn to sell and trade in everything. Now, we've learned to trade in grain. Yeah, we're still learning to trade in grain. Okay. Somebody who spent his entire career in industry, so he told me once, I bought 15,000 hectares of Ukrainian land, and he says, look, why face all this trouble, all this music to create those products, to win on Prozora and then sell? Look, in agriculture, when I've sown grain, it's already sold, it's pre-sold. So are you saying that we haven't learned to sell? 100%. Absolutely. It's a very simple message. Export is simple. Yeah, it is. It may not be that simple, but we need to bring home to businesses that whatever they are producing is what I'm manufacturing potentially exportable. Yes, because the markets of Ukraine may be 40 million, but we need to think about the 500 million market of the EU, China 1.5 billion, and those should be our targets. Okay, on a more positive note, Taras mentioned already. Now, okay, grain, our bumper crop. Oh, if we sell over 100 million tons in grain, in vegetable oil, the value of that is how much? $35 billion. The scandal between France and Australia and the US over those submarines. It's 3 or 4 submarines, all in all. It is the same amount. 4 submarines versus the whole country working hard to sow and harvest, competing for the same value. Okay, maybe if you could supply some success stories. I remember you spoke about the case of Ukraine exporting snails. Now, what I love about Ukrainian businessmen, okay, when somebody's discovered something, so the first person who found out that it was quite easy to farm snails, we now have over 400 companies producing and selling snails, selling more those escargots more than any other country. Now, we like honey. Now we are fourth in the world in honey. Then we saw in the neighboring country of Poland that they were very strong in berries. Now, Ukraine has so much. So it's actually just as in a snails and escargots that we are going to be as strong in berries. Now, what we need to really understand and consolidate our efforts is that it's not only for businesses, that we need to all work as one team, that exports is something that we all want, and everyone should get behind this and help in any way they can. Just as Dmitro concluded, why we were losing? Because money is expensive, credit is not easily accessible. Yes, but I like the statement that only together we can win. According to the International Competitiveness Report of the World Economic Forum dated 2019, Ukraine is in 85th place out of 141. Poland ranks 37th. That global competitiveness index is made up of over 100 variables. Grouped into 12 big measures. And one is competitiveness, company competitiveness, and there are other elements, domestic policy, protectionism. So now I would like to hand over to Margaret and ask her, what should a country do? How should they work together and consolidate efforts in helping Ukraine and each Ukrainian company to become an exporter and be successful as an exporter? How to improve Ukraine's ranking in global competitiveness? Margaret, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Elena. My translation was breaking up, so I hope I heard everything, and that's why I have to sit like this, because otherwise I'll lose the connection with the translator. Okay, so the question was, what can Ukraine do to strengthen, and how can we work together to...
Yes, how to work together for the government, for the business to be more competitive on the global markets.
So let me maybe take a step back, and I thought the discussion that I heard was very interesting, and I completely agree with Gennady's point that Ukraine really needs to look globally and outward. It has a fairly big national market, but it is not sufficient in order to be successful and to increase its GDP over the long term. At the same time, it has an industrial structure that is not necessarily, that needs to make a huge jump in order to be competitive at the international market and move out of the commodities exports as well, right? In order to move to manufacturing production, it is a significant step that needs to be taken in terms of the skills that are necessary. You mentioned English speaking, which is one, but it's also around sales skills, around market knowledge, around exploring markets, around business models. So there's a lot that needs to be done by the Ukrainian businesses and also by the supported potentially by the government in order to improve those skills. When I look at the global perspective, and a lot of our work is actually with some of the most advanced countries worldwide, and we advise them also on how to change and how to think more strategically about their international positioning as well. A lot of the work that we do right now is around this, and we do also look a lot at global megatrends and how they influence a country's positioning. So global megatrends are trends such as, the digitization of the global economy, technology trends, also the trends towards more sustainability, for example. So the trends that shape markets globally, changing consumer behaviors as well. And, I think this is something that I see when we look at how some of the most advanced countries react to this, for example, Singapore, and how they take on those global trends, how proactively they identify those global trends, and they identify opportunities in global markets based on the global trends. it is, there's a lot remains to be done also in Ukraine. And let me just give you an example. We recently worked with a South African company that was exporting. They actually wanted to do alcohol, right? They're producing alcohol from agave plants. They, due to WTO rules, they were not able to sell it as tequila. The market collapsed, and within a very short period of time, they were able to change the production and produce agave syrup, because agave syrup is something that, due to the rising health consciousness of the global population, was very much in demand in European and US American markets. And they got fairly quickly investment. They identified this opportunity, and this step of identifying this opportunity is, I think, something that's very important. How do you identify this kind of opportunities? How do you recognize those opportunities? So in order to be able to do those, companies need to be equipped to constantly follow the markets and also the trends outside of their direct markets, right? The consumer behaviors in those markets as well. And this is a really important aspect that is, that really, in the very short term, can give you a huge advantage on global markets, right? And the same with, this, how do you replicate the snails example, right? How do you make it more frequent? How do you take it to other industries as well, right? To other subsectors. So, and how do you, this is essentially the question, right? How do you identify this type of market opportunities? For this, you need to scan the markets constantly. And this can be a central role, right? This can be something that the government helps the businesses to do if the businesses don't have this access and they don't have this information about consumer trends. You need to be quite on the beat. So this is one aspect. The second aspect that I wanted to mention is, of course, manufacturing and commodities commodities exports are responsible for a lot of employment and are very important. But let's not forget services exports, because what has been growing very strongly in recent years and much faster than the manufacturing and the goods exports are the services exports. So this is where a lot of opportunities being created. So how can Ukrainian businesses leverage this trend of growing services exports? And many of those services exports are related to digital economies, where Ukraine has the advantage of having a very educated labor force, right? A lot of services exports depend on a very educated labor force. There is a lot of this know-how and a lot of the skills here around software programming, for example, right? So how can those trends be leveraged more strongly? This is one question. I think the one piece from my perspective that is missing, and this is from looking at innovation systems around the world and also startup systems around the world, is, and what makes startups successful and able to scale, is this intricate knowledge of business models and how business models are changing. Because this is what makes you really competitive on the global scale as well. Business models in recent years have changed significantly. Many of the business models that are working right now, that are really growing very fast right now, are digital business models that operate on very different parameters than the traditional business models. So knowledge of those business models is really key, and how to make them work is really key in order to be competitiveness in the services sector, which is really important as well. And maybe one last piece around the element of public-private collaboration, Elena, that you mentioned. I think there's a significant potential for strengthening the public-private collaboration around knowing where systemic change is happening. And let me explain this a little bit more. Many of the markets that are high growth markets right now, globally, are around social impact, ESG-related topics, for example, right? Environmental, social, and governance factors. This is where a lot of the growth is happening right now. Green markets, green growth is a big topic as well. And this is, I think, where also public-private collaboration can play a huge role to better understand those markets, to better understand what's happening in those markets globally as well, and how Ukrainian businesses could benefit from those markets beyond just the commodity side of things, and really move into the more advanced and the more value-added exports in this space.
It's an interesting question to identify the global trends and opportunities for the country. And I have another questions to you. Нещодавно в Україні
Ukraine has recently adopted a new law on virtual assets. It has not come into effect, and it seeks to introduce cryptocurrencies. And in this context, what I would like to ask is, there's quite a handful of countries who've introduced cryptocurrency regulation of some sort.
To use this opportunity for Ukraine to be the first, okay, in the first 5 countries in the world who will work with the cryptocurrency. And globally, what do you think? How the developing countries can win in this area?
Yes.
Especially knowing that the IT sector in Ukraine is very strong.
Yes, yes, and I think it's so. There's two elements to this cryptocurrency debate. I think one thing that strikes me, we've been hearing a lot about gas prices and energy prices, and we should not forget that mining cryptocurrency is very energy intensive, right? So it will not fully do away with the dependence on energy prices. This is the first thing. The second element is, I think, betting purely on cryptocurrency may be tricky in the short term, because there is still we still don't know where it's going to land exactly, right? There's a lot of governments coming into the space with digital currencies. There is a lot of talk about potential regulation of cryptocurrencies. So it is a bit of a risky bet, I think, in order to be betting on cryptocurrencies right now. But yes, there is definitely a potential in there. I think what's really interesting about the cryptocurrencies in the underlying technology, which is the blockchain, and definitely, knowledge and building up competencies around blockchain can be very interesting for Ukraine, because the blockchain technology, or distributed ledger technology, so even broader than blockchain, are going to be very important in many aspects of business life. A lot of contracts, supply chain contracts, for example, are being put on blockchain or on distributed ledger. So that's definitely a technology that's going to be, it could be potentially one of the general purpose technologies of the future. And there's a lot of potential for Ukraine to position itself very early on in terms of distributed ledger technologies and being able to benefit from that trend.
Especially taking into account that Ukraine is not only the agri country, it's also the very huge and most a very strong IT country in the world. Mr. Kupan, як ви вважаєте, can you hear me?
Mr. Koopman, can you hear me? Can you? How do you find your 3 recommendations? What businesses and the government should do to improve competitiveness dramatically in foreign markets? 3 recommendations.
Focus on ensuring you have the appropriate infrastructure, which is both physical and software related, in other words, rules and institutions, so that your firms can compete globally. Think about enhancing in that software the digital aspect, not necessarily cryptocurrency. I think Margareta correctly identified that could be a very risky area, but the government could leapfrog and create a much more digital trading environment that would lower the costs of engaging in global trade. I heard earlier that there were concerns about the small number of firms in Ukraine engaging in exporting. That's not unusual, by the way. That's very typical. Globally, it's usually a small number of firms that export. But one way to allow smaller firms to export is to reduce the costs involved with engaging in those global markets and looking at how digital technologies can reduce the paperwork, enhance the transparency of the regulations and things like that could very well help encourage more firms to export. Another thing I have to say, the kind of discussion I heard from the private sector on this panel is a discussion I hear in just about every interaction with the private sector in every country. So what I'm trying to say is that a lot of the concerns that I've heard are not unique to Ukraine. I did hear that there's been a big growth in exports, which I find very interesting, that there are challenges around bilateral negotiations. Let me remind you that 75 to 80% of global trade occurs on WTO terms in terms of tariffs. 75 to 80%. That may be surprising to people. But there is still, beyond tariffs, these trade costs, whether it's the ability to move goods out of ports, the ability to do the paperwork, thinking about how you enhance your domestic transportation and software environment to enhance competitiveness is critical. And there's a very important digital aspect to that. Then Margareta mentioned this, and I was thinking about it. You have to know what the foreign countries want for demand. Tapping into foreign demand allows your firms to have a market that's bigger than the domestic market. But you have to know what the foreign demand, what the attributes of either the firms or the consumers want. And Margareta, I think, appropriately indicated, you have to have that understanding. And you can discover great markets like snails and escargot, that's wonderful. But you have to have that outward orientation and that willingness to learn about what do foreign markets need, what do they want, where are they growing fast, and how can I adapt my domestic production to do that. Finally, that implies thinking more about your offensive interests than your defensive interests. And frankly, on the panel, I heard a lot about defensive interests. And I think you need to be thinking more about where does Ukraine see opportunities. They'll face challenges in trying to pursue those opportunities, but too many countries are focused on their defensive interests, trying to protect the domestic market and not thinking about where are their opportunities in those fast-growing foreign markets that countries like Israel and Singapore focus very much on. They very much want to know where is their fast growth, how can they tap into that? And I think it means changing your mindset from being so inwardly focused to being more outwardly focused. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent. Я погоджуюсь з тим, що
I quite agree that there are two policies, an offensive one and a defensive one. Either you are defending your own interests, you're looking for ways to defend your own interests, or else you change your sort of mindset and you look outward. Now that we spoken about escargots, okay, let's be fair. The escargot market is 400 to 500 tons. That is, last season, about 200 tons had to be dumped. Some 30, 40 tons was exported out of Ukraine. So it's a big myth. So, my dear friends, when you are using this myth, it's good. It's good. We have now the Escargot Association, which is a member of my federation. They are now making a huge loss. So let's not prop up those myths. So it's okay. Yeah, but it was a kind of just to give it a positive spin. There may be ups and downs, successes and failures, and but look, how a Ukrainian exporter lives in terms of logistics. Now, we produce products that are competitive in EU markets. Now, the next challenge is to make arrangements to supply that product. The next question that comes up is the issue of licenses and permits. And many exporters know what it takes to deliver to Poland, to Hungary. Now, in the autumn, it's going to be very crazy during the autumn period because you have a contract, you have a product that the buyer is expecting. Often, your product is part of their technology. It's an input for them. And we are constrained because there are barriers standing in the way, preventing us from delivering. And this is our reality for many exporters. I know your pain. I know that we have so much homework to do. Taras, like I would like to go back to our vote. I think that it will actually show what really matters to businesses. Now, the most important thing is number one is public policy protecting the domestic producer. Now, Dmitro and his statements and messages and now and then Friedrich List has been translated into Ukrainian. So on a policy level, it is all very correct that positions of producers in the domestic market. So now, if we were to kind of identify a positive versus negative space in this, now I quite agree that, well, indeed, 80% of Ukrainian success in exports is that Ukraine is a member of the WTO. We might not have exceeded on the best of terms, but that it has boosted exports is a given. The biggest problem is where we are fighting over access to high value added territory. But that fight, high value, that is where issues come up. Is it licensing? Yes, I'm coming on to this. Now, I can speak to licenses 2 years now because once I spoke about it, the Polish ambassador wrote a note of protest. But I still continue to believe that what Poland is doing in licensing policy, it's one example, is that when reluctance, it's to admit Ukraine as a direct counterparty and just to encourage Ukraine to continue trading through Polish intermediaries in this case. And that is just one example among many. The same applies to our state of negotiations with Turkey. In terms of what we have achieved under the WTO with Turkey, it's a big plus. But in critical, most coveted products, it's where we've experienced most of the problems. Now, when it's very hard to speak about trade on the general level. Okay, why has the hryvnia been appreciating? Okay, it's actually an indirect consequences of increasing exports, because as exports grow, more foreign exchange comes into the country, and the value of the national currency increases. Okay, it's good to be optimistic, but well, but it's not so good at the same time, and the same applies to being too pessimistic. Why I qualified the statement that we've learned to sell grain. Now, we rank second globally by value derived from grain trade. But this is just an effect of scale. But in terms of prices, Ukraine's grain is the cheapest globally, and we are accustomed to selling the cheapest grain. And if even, look, if we are selling free on board, we are not even exporting. It is a foreign company that is picking up product from Ukraine. But going further downstream is what actually Gennady spoke about. That's where is the most value is to be derived. Those are growing pains. So a skeptical discussion is necessary, but it is always about growth. But yes, but we need to keep you. Actually, we don't want you to relax. We want you to keep fighting. So when we speak about growing pains, and it's now it's not we need to learn not just to sell, but to sell online, and we're talking about digitization, and we are still learning to sell our wheat. So we keep facing more and more challenges, but we need to pick up pace, and companies together with the government to promote export potential and competitiveness of this country will definitely help us rise in global rankings. Now we only have a couple of minutes left. Victor of the call of this discussion club, I would like to praise Taras, and I'll let me go back to Switzerland. That's where we started. So, just 30 seconds. A bubble background. In 2010, we created the 2010-2030 economic growth strategy with 26 global challenges, and Ukraine could contribute to resolving two: food and clean water. The word industry was not even there. There was a grant that was given by the EU. It was actually handled through the Ministry of Education. There were 5 industries: green and energy, tourism, agriculture, and some more. So the question is, we started fighting neoliberals. That Ukraine is not the government is not a watchdog. So, and Maksuta, Vanshenko, and Olinik, and so we've been able to persuade many people. I really enjoyed listening to Taras that, okay, we were not taught the right way of doing it. And that this evolution, the fact that it is going on within public administration, within the civil service, it is a very welcome sign. And it's good that there is growing appreciation of this. Now, the link to Switzerland, and I would like to thank you for your very proactive position in defending Ukraine's interests in anti-dumping. Now, Switzerland. Our Ukrainian railways now announced it at tender bid, 31 billion hryvnias. Now, Krukov, the local railcar maker, is going to block traffic and in protest, and it's this whole, they are defending their own interests. Otherwise, so that's how is the ministry going to react to that? Maybe resign your office, but because there is a foreign maker that appears to be is going to be preferred. Now, Belarus, that is nationally sanctioned, but it wins tender bids, which in Ukraine allows them to do it, and selling their machines. The Belarusian government is really very strongly supportive of its exports, and it's and our legislation that the Federation is promoting a localization act. Has not been adopted, and such laws actually work in the US and other countries. I would like to thank Taras for fighting and for defending this. Taras, very briefly, okay, it's a good consolidated position in public procurement. Public procurement. There is one thing that we need to understand, that our biggest enemy in public procurement, it's not that those Belarusians are winning. It's just because Ukrainian clients are willing to buy from them. And this is a big concern, because I've actually had to face it, that in many situations now, public procurement is something that promotes imports. They are ready to give up Ukraine's national interests, and if an importer is offering a price that's 2 cents lower, but all those that are buyers as part of public procurement, they are happy to rush and to that small economy. Now, when there was talk about banning exports from Russia, and big companies that under public procurement legislation, they were defending their right to continue buying from Russia. Now, wait a minute. So it is all, and the same applies to Ukrainian railways. The same applies to localization. It's a situation in which 90% of success is for a Ukrainian buyer to learn to appreciate that even under the law as it stands currently, without localization, they have the right to qualify their tender terms to restrict eligibility to Ukrainian producers. Now, okay, you got your compliment. Now you should have said thank you, and that's it, and be done with it. Now, and then, look, it's not. I'm not fishing for compliments here. Now, localization is different. Another matter, something very important indeed. Because look, I've personally invested very strongly in changing the EU's position that they held about this law. We've come to realize that the issue is that initially, no, you don't have the right to seek localization. And the first battle to fight was to get them to admit that we did have that right. But look, the issue is that to fight to defend your own rights, and to even, okay, let me paraphrase it. Okay, poking somebody, your enemy, with a fork in their eye, sometimes if it does the job, it's good. But if you're doing this out of aesthetic satisfaction, you shouldn't poke them unless you absolutely must, unless you have to do it. So, no, it's like if it is it's a very sort of bloodthirsty kind of uh, analogy. Now, we should fight in a civilized manner to defend our right to localization when we realize that our biggest problem in public procurement is okay. Because there are Belarusians, Kazakhs, and other countries, they are not admitting us to bid for contracts in their public procurement markets. Not even the EU. There is a civilized way in which to address this, to avoid any political pressures or any litigation or anything. So the sooner we adopt the localization bill, the better. Taras, so it's on the Prime Minister's table that there is a draft Cabinet of Ministers resolution written by the Ministry of Economy, endorsed by the Ministry of Justice, that has been cleared by all government committees, something that I told the Prime Minister only yesterday. It is about a machine building experiment, is the title of the law. So when public procurement is contracted, non-pricing criteria should be preferred. We don't even need a law to address. The Prime Minister needs to put it on the agenda of the executive government, and then this will send a very strong signal to anyone buying under public procurement, whenever they are buying whatever they are buying, to grant a big preference to domestic manufacturers. I'm not trying to take up too much of your time, but when somebody was creating this vote, you're stealing time from exporters. I don't see any point in this survey at all. What I'm talking about something very, very specific, and it is such resolutions that could potentially give a fresh impetus to promoting economic growth. It is GDP growth, and it's either 50,000 jobs will be created, or they will move to Switzerland, to Stettler, or Elstone, to France. It's really important to support Ukrainian producers, but we're not only talking about large businesses, we're talking about small, medium-sized businesses, and I know lots and lots of great projects, very successful projects of Ukrainians succeeding in global markets without having to rely on any support from the government whatsoever, just because people love what they do. They know how to hold negotiations. They are prepared to take risks and present their interests and defend Ukraine's national interests in the best possible way. I would like to thank everyone who's taken part in this discussion. Yes, absolutely. Yours is the last question. Yes, I think I deserve the right to respond to that because you mentioned Vera Galasuk of the Ukrainian Association of the Club of Rome. Yes, indeed, we published Frederick List's book, but I would like to respond to a statement by another speaker, Mr. Linek. I very deeply respect you for your work and for the Federation of Employers, that indeed you are actually and genuinely defending the interests of Ukrainian manufacturers, not only Ukrainian, but only foreigners who've built their own manufacturing facilities here. This is not a compliment, this is a statement of fact. Now, one more thing that I would like to say. Now, we seem to be having somebody just impose some sort of myth on us. Okay, as if there was this dichotomy, those bad protectionists wishing to defend the local market, and there are those goal dreamers who always need to look outward. There are immense opportunities out there. So, on a more practical note, speak to any Ukrainian manufacturer. Lviv has has Electron, the big manufacturing company with thousands of shareholders, and whenever they. So, what is the question? So, look, it's a remark. If I just 1 minute, and I'll be done, if I may. Yeah, you actually overdrawn your time. I don't want these to turn into a series of monologues. I would like to, because Taras mentioned me, so just let me follow through. So when Electron knocks on Poland's door to sell their products, the Poles go, good product, good price. Who's buying it in Ukraine? When in Kiev, in Kiev city, they're buying Polish trams. Other cities are buying used foreign trams, not buying brand new trams from Electron. how can you expect an importer to favor Ukrainian product? There is no dichotomy, there is no conflict between defending a domestic market and export expansion. What Alinik said is what's needed: a friendly policy for any manufacturing based in Ukraine and selling out of Ukraine, whether domestically or internationally. Now, it's something that you spoke about successful Ukrainian manufacturers. When they're successful in Ukraine, they are simply doomed to be internationally competitive. I would like to thank everyone for your useful input during this panel discussion, for sharing your views, for expressing your impressions and sharing your useful advice. Thank you. You all did a great job, and I would like to see our country and our manufacturers to develop and improve their export potential.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Margaret.